Imagine a place you went to every day. Not a prison, not a hospital, not a morgue. An ordinary public toilet in Victorian London. But it was here that disease was born. The air was heavy, thick, almost sticky. The smell was a mixture of ammonia, rot, and moisture. The light from the gas lamps trembled as if afraid to stay. People came in healthy and came out already doomed. Cholera, typhus, dysentery. Invisible death did not live on the streets. It waited underground. And the scariest thing, no one understood why this was happening. Could you survive in a city where even the most ordinary need became a mortal risk? This is not a horror story. This is history. The city under feet. London, mid-19th century. A city growing faster than it can breathe. The streets are crowded. The buildings are built close together. Thousands of people in neighborhoods that were never planned for so many residents. But the real London was not only above, it was hidden below. Under the cobblestones, under the basements, under the foundations. A world of tunnels, drains, cesspools. And there was its own ecosystem. Moisture ran down the brick walls. Water seeped through the soil, mixing with waste. The air was almost motionless. Gas lamps barely pierced the darkness, creating bizarre shadows that moved with every step. Man descended and, as it were, left civilization behind. Public toilets were seen as a sign of progress, a modern solution for the modern city. But the problem wasn't the idea. The problem was where it all went. Most toilets didn't have a real drain. They led into cesspools, into underground tanks, into systems that were almost never cleaned properly. Waste piled up, day after day, year after year. Sometimes the pit was right under a building, sometimes near a water source, sometimes next to a well from which entire families drank. No one had yet spoken of bacteria, about microbes, about infections in the modern sense. Disease back then was explained by bad air, miasmas, an ominous fog of death, which supposedly arose from dirt and decay. And if there was darkness, dampness, and stench below, people believed this is the source of evil. But the truth was even more dangerous, because death came not only through smell, it came through water, through hands, through touch, through the very fact of being in this environment. Going down to such a toilet was almost a ritual. The stairs down, the narrow passage, stone walls, the echo of footsteps, and the feeling that you are entering a place where something is wrong, where the air seems older than the city itself, where each breath seems heavier than the previous one. And yet, people went, because they had no choice. The city of progress, the city of industry, a city of empire, and a city where even the simplest human need could be the first step to illness, to fever, to a slow, exhausting death. The smell that doesn't go. The descent began with a sound. Not voices, not conversations, but footsteps. A dull echo on the stone stairs, leading down into a space where the city no longer made noise, but whispered. The air changed almost immediately. It became thicker, warmer, humid, and most importantly, heavy. The smell wasn't just felt, it was oppressive. a mixture of rot, ammonia, dampness, and something sweetly disgusting that settled in the throat and remained there even after leaving. People got used to it. As one gets used to everything, that becomes part of daily necessity. Victorian London didn't have the luxury of cleanliness. Millions of bodies, thousands of houses, streets that were fields yesterday. The city was growing faster than the system that could clean up after it. Public toilets seemed like a solution, a sign of civilization. But inside, they were stone chambers slowly decaying. Moisture ran down the walls. The floor often remained slippery. The wooden doors swelled with dampness. And somewhere down below, under the grates, the slabs, the openings, lived a cesspool. It was not abstract. It was physically present. A dark mass that accumulated, breathed, evaporated, released gases. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, poisonous fumes. Sometimes the lamps dimmed for no reason. Sometimes the flames flickered strangely. Sometimes people felt dizzy, which was attributed to fatigue. No one said, "This air can kill," because back then they didn't understand exactly how. Smell in those days was almost a sentence. If it stinks, it means it's dangerous. If it's sharp, it means it's deadly. Thus was born the theory of miasms, the belief that diseases arise from bad air. And indeed, there was bad air underground. But the smell was only a signal, not the cause. The real danger was quieter, more invisible, on door handles, on faucets, on surfaces, on hands. The moisture that seemed like just dampness was often a mixture of condensation and microscopic particles of waste. A person touched a wall, the handrail, the door, the clothes, then the face, the lips, the food, and the chain was already running. In cramped quarters, toilets were used by hundreds of people a day, and almost no one talked about disinfection, about sterility, about germs. Water was a luxury. Soap was not always available, and the concept of hygiene was still in its infancy. Some toilets were rarely cleaned. Some were cleaned formally. Some were almost never cleaned properly. Stains on the stone, dark marks on the walls, moisture that never dried, and the smell. The smell that did not disappear even on the street. It seemed to follow a person, in clothes, in hair, in memory. Londoners joked about it, but the joke was a way to avoid thinking about the main thing, that each such descent could be an encounter with something much worse than discomfort. Because it was here, in the darkness, dampness, and dirt, that the disease found ideal conditions. The warmth, the humidity, the human flow. And the city did not yet know that it was already living inside a slow catastrophe. Water that killed. In Victorian London, water looked innocent, transparent, cold, life-giving. It flowed from columns, pumps, public taps. It was poured into mugs. It was used to brew tea. It was used to feed children. Water was a symbol of purity, and no one saw a threat in it. But the city was already poisoned, not by the smoke of factories, not by the mists of the Thames, but by what was seeping into the ground. There were cesspools everywhere, under houses, in yards, near basements, near wells. They were not airtight. They breathed. The liquid slowly seeped into the ground, moving to where no one expected it. To drinking water sources, to pumps, to underground streams. London grew chaotically. Sewage was decades behind. In many areas, waste and drinking water existed side by side, sometimes separated by only a few feet of soil, sometimes by a crack in the rock, sometimes by nothing at all. A person could drink water that had been part of a cesspool yesterday. Of course, he didn't know it. The water didn't smell like death. It didn't have the color of danger. It looked normal. And then the fever would come. Suddenly, without warning. First weakness, then stomach pain, then a thirst that couldn't be quenched. Cholera, a word that began to sound like a sentence. The city observed a strange pattern. People were getting sick in neighborhoods, streets, houses, entire families, neighbors, residents of one neighborhood, and almost no one in another. It didn't look like bad air. The smell was everywhere, but death was selective. Doctors argued. Newspapers were scared. Miasmas were blamed. But the truth was already at hand. In 1854, the cholera outbreak in Soho became a moment that changed the history of medicine. Dr. John Snow did something that seemed almost absurd at the time. He began to count, not to treat. Addresses of the dead, water sources, pumps. The map began to speak. And she said a terrible thing. Death was concentrated around one water pump. Broad Street. The water that was considered clean was contaminated. Not the air, not the smell, but the water. An invisible enemy. Tiny organisms that most people never knew existed. The solution was radical and simple. Remove the handle from the pump, and when the water was no longer available, the flash began to fade. It was almost unbelievable. The city refused to believe it, because if water could kill, then danger was everywhere, in every sip, in every home, in every public place, including in public toilets, where waste accumulated, seeped, mixed with underground streams, where the cycle of infection became almost perfect. A person went to the toilet, touched surfaces, came out, drank water, and the disease closed the circle, without noise, without drama, without warning. Victorian London would long fear smells, but the real horror was that the most deadly smell was nothing. When the city began to die. Outbreaks of disease in London were no longer rare. They became a rhythm, periodic, frightening, almost habitual. The newspapers wrote about the numbers, the hospitals about the overcrowding, the cemeteries about the lack of space. But for the average person, the epidemic did not begin with statistics. It began with a neighbor, a familiar voice that suddenly disappeared, a door that no longer opened, a window that remained dark. Cholera came quickly, cruelly, with no chance of long goodbyes. Just yesterday, a person went to work. Today, he lay, exhausted by vomiting and thirst. Tomorrow, he was gone. The city was afraid, but it did not understand. The miasma theory still dominated. It was believed that disease was born of stench, from dirt, from bad air. And London did stink. The Thames turned into an open sewer in the summer. The cesspools overflowed. The streets were covered in a mixture of dirt, manure, and waste. And then came 1858, the year that went down in history as the Great Stink. The heat was unbearable. The Thames was almost motionless. The smell rose over the city in a thick wave. Even Parliament could not stand it. Curtains soaked in bleach. Soaked fabrics on the windows. Desperate attempts to drown out what could not be ignored. Politicians could no longer pretend that the problem was exaggerated. The smell forced the authorities to do what thousands of deaths had not, to take action. But the paradox was that the stench was not the main threat. It was only a symptom. The real disaster was already happening underground. Public toilets, cesspools, drains, all of this became part of a single cycle. Waste went into the river into the water supply, water into people's bodies, and the circle closed. Death no longer seemed like an accident. It became systemic, predictable, inevitable. It was felt most acutely in poor neighborhoods. Cramped rooms, lack of ventilation, shared water sources. Public toilets used by hundreds of people, one infected person, one pump, one tank. And the disease spread through the streets faster than any fire. Fear was everywhere. People avoided certain neighborhoods. They suspected bad air. They feared fogs. They wore smelly handkerchiefs. But they continued to drink the same water, to go to the same toilets, to breathe the same air. Because there was no choice. London was a trap. A giant, living, industrial trap. And only now was the city beginning to realize the problem wasn't the smell. The problem was the system of existence itself. In How the City Handled Its Waste, and at what price it was paying for it, underground. There was another London beneath London. No sun, no sky, no fresh air. A world of brick, stone, and moisture. Tunnels, vaults, sewers, and the endless movement of what the city preferred not to think about. Waste. Public toilets were just entrances, small doors into a complex, dark infrastructure that had one purpose: to take away what the city left behind. But the system remained primitive for a long time. The cesspools overflowed. The drains ran slowly. The sediment accumulated over the years. The underground was constantly damp. Drops dripped from the ceilings. Water seeped through the seams of the bricks. The surfaces never completely dried. People worked here whom the city hardly a million. People worked here whom the city hardly noticed. Night cleaners, night soil men, those who went down when others went to bed. They cleaned pits. They pumped out waste. They carried things that could not be left under the houses forever. It was dangerous work, not only because of the smell, because of the air. Poisonous gases accumulated in enclosed spaces. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, colorless, without warning. A person could take a few breaths and lose consciousness. Sometimes it happened silently, without a scream, without a struggle. Just a body no longer rising from the slippery floor. The underworld was unstable. The walls were crumbling. The ground was sinking. The tanks were cracking. The contents could leak. Slowly, imperceptibly, into the groundwater, into the cellars, into the source of drinking water. The The city above lived its own life. Shops, carriages, factories, theaters, and almost no one thought that a dark river of waste was moving literally beneath their feet. Public toilets became points of intersection between the world of people and the world of decay. The places where these two Londons touched each other most closely: the stone stairs down, the narrow passages, the damp brick, and the feeling that you were entering a space that was not meant for long stay. But people came in every day because the city demanded it, because the body demanded it, because there were no alternatives. And it was here, in the darkness of the underground chambers, that the disease felt most comfortable. People who lived among the dirt. Unsanitary conditions in Victorian London were no exception. It was the norm, especially for those who had no choice. Poor neighborhoods, cramped rooms where several generations lived, windows that hardly opened, dampness that settled on the walls in a thin, cold layer. And the toilet, not in the house, not in the apartment, but somewhere outside, in the yard or on the street, public, shared, for dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. Queues were common, in the morning, in the evening, at night. People stood in silence, avoiding looking each other in the eye, because even this simple need reminded us of the fragility of dignity. The floor is slippery, the walls are damp, the air is almost still. Water for washing hands is not always available. Soap is a luxury. Children came in barefoot. Workers came after the factories. Women held their breath. And no one thought about germs, because they were not seen, because they were not yet understood. Diseases seemed mysterious, almost mystical. Why was a person healthy yesterday, and today he cannot get out of bed? Why does a fever sweep an entire street? Why does death come to one house and bypass another? The answers were lost between fear and ignorance. In poor areas, cesspools were often overflowing. Waste seeped into the soil, into the basements, into the water. Sometimes the smell just lingered in the rooms. It wasn't harsh. It was constant, background, inherent, as part of the air, as part of life. People got used to it, to the smell, to the dampness, to the risk. Because when you live in danger every day, fear gets tiring. But the body doesn't. Infant mortality was horribly high. Infections spread like wildfire. One contaminated water source, one toilet, one tank, and the disease swept through the area like an invisible wave. The hospital was far away. Treatment was expensive. Understanding the causes was almost non-existent. A person could survive a fire, could have survived a factory injury, could have avoided a crime, but lost to a simple glass of water or a trip to a public toilet. The irony of progress was cruel. A city that prided itself on industry could not provide basic safety for its own residents, and the most vulnerable paid first, and paid the most. The disease without a face. It didn't knock on the door. It didn't warn. It didn't leave time to prepare. In Victorian London, disease often appeared as a whisper, which, within a few days, became the cry of an entire neighborhood. First, rumors. There's another death in the next street. There's some kind of fever in the docks. People are falling down at work in Soho. The city listened, and it was afraid. But the fear was vague, because the enemy was invisible. Cholera had no face. It didn't look like a wound. It left no outward signs of danger. A person could look perfectly normal the day before death. The symptoms came on rapidly: pain, convulsions, exhaustion, thirst that became torture. The body lost fluid faster than it could be replaced. The skin turned pale. The eyes sank. The voice weakened. Sometimes death came in a matter of hours. The city did not have time to realize the scale. Yesterday, isolated cases. Today, dozens. Tomorrow, hundreds. Hospitals are overflowing. Corridors are filled with beds. Doctors are exhausted, often powerless. Because treatment without understanding the causes was almost a blind struggle. London lived in constant tension. Any outbreak could become a catastrophe. Any news, a trigger for panic. People avoided certain areas. They closed their windows. They wore odorous substances. It was believed that a strong smell could protect against bad air. But the disease paid no attention to smells. It moved by water, by touch, by contact. And public toilets became ideal nodes for this spread. Here, everyone intersected. Workers, traders, children, travelers. One infected, one surface, one touch, and the chain began again. Fear had a strange form. People were afraid of fog, smells, the Thames. But they continued to live in the same conditions. Because how could you avoid something that was part of daily survival? The public toilet was not a choice. It was a necessity, like food, like water, like work. And that was what made the situation particularly cruel. A faceless enemy, soundless, smellless, but with an absolutely real mortality. The moment when everything broke. Epidemics in London were not just a medical problem. They were a social explosion. Fear quickly turned to suspicion. People looked for blame. It's because of the poor. It's because of the dirty neighborhoods. It's because of the foreigners. A city terrified of death always seeks a simple explanation, but the truth was more complicated and much scarier. Because the disease knew no class. It passed through walls, through neighborhoods, through wealth. The wealthy neighborhoods had better conditions, but they had no immunity. Contaminated water could get in anywhere. Contact could happen anywhere. Public toilets, pumps, drains, everything was part of the same system. And when the system failed, the city literally stopped. Shops closed earlier. The streets were empty. Newspapers were published with black headlines. The number of deaths was frightening even for those who were accustomed to the cruelty of the big city. Hospitals could not accommodate everyone. Sometimes they left the sick at home. Sometimes they simply tried to isolate them. Sometimes they waited. Because what else could be done? Death came too quickly. Families fell apart in a few days. Children were orphaned. Houses were empty. Workplaces were without people. And it was at these moments that the miasmatic theory began to crack. Because the smell was everywhere, and death was not. Because the stench did not explain why one street was dying while the next one was almost untouched. New voices were emerging, new doubts, new observations, maps, statistics, analysis of water sources, and gradually an idea was formed that turned the idea of the disease upside down. The problem was not in the air. The problem was in the water, in the waste, in invisible organisms. This was the moment when the old picture of the world began to collapse. Painfully, slowly, with resistance. Because to accept this meant to admit the city itself creates its own epidemics. And public toilets, cesspools, sewers were not just an inconvenience, but part of a deadly mechanism. Engineers against death. When fear reached its limit, the city finally did what it had been putting off for years. It turned not only to doctors, but to engineers. Because it became clear the problem is not just the disease. The problem is the very design of the city, where the waste disappears and where the water goes. After the Great Stink of 1858, the political will suddenly appeared. What for decades had been considered too expensive suddenly became necessary for the survival of the capital of the empire. On the scene enters Joseph Bazalgette, a man who did not cure disease, but changed the course of the history of mortality. His plan was grandiose: a new sewage system, deeper, larger, designed not for years, but for generations to come. Tunnels that could divert waste away from sources of drinking water, collectors that intercepted the drains, pumps, vaults, kilometers of brick arteries underground. It was an engineering war against decay, against contamination, against an invisible enemy. Construction lasted for years. The city was being dug up. The streets were changing. Underground London was being rebuilt almost from scratch. And it wasn't just an infrastructure upgrade. It was a change in philosophy. For the first time, the city began to think systematically. Waste is not something that can simply be hidden. It needs to be controlled, isolate, dispose of. Public toilets were also gradually changing. Better ventilation, better drainage, better connection to the sewerage system. Slowly, unevenly, but the direction was already different, and the statistics were beginning to show it. Cholera outbreaks were becoming less frequent, less devastating, less apocalyptic. The city was not yet safe, but it was no longer completely defenseless. It was a quiet turning point. No loud celebrations, no fanfare, because people rarely notice the moment when death retreats. But it was then, in the dark tunnels of the new sewers, London began to win its longest battle. Cleanliness that came late. Changes were not instantaneous. New tunnels did not erase old habits. New sewers did not eliminate fear overnight. London was still a city of contrasts. Alongside modern sewers, old cesspools existed. Alongside engineering progress, neighborhoods where unsanitary conditions remained the norm. Cleanliness in the 19th century was not an automatic consequence of technology. It was a cultural revolution. People had lived with a different logic for decades. Smell equals danger. Appearance equals cleanliness. If the water is clear, it is safe to drink. If the room does not stink, it is safe. But new science began to destroy these ideas. Microbes, invisible, odorless, colorless. An idea that sounded almost fantastic. That death could lurk where the human eye could see nothing threatening. That water that looked clean could be deadly. That a surface without visible dirt could carry disease. It was hard to accept. Even harder was changing behavior. Hand washing, regular cleaning, disinfection, ventilation. It seems obvious today. Back then, it was new thinking. Public toilets began to transform. brighter spaces, better ventilation, water for hand washing, more controlled sewage disposal. But these changes came too late for thousands of people, for those who had already survived cholera, for families who had lost children, for neighborhoods that remembered the days when death went door to door. The city was becoming safer, but the memory remained. Fear of bad places, disgust for underground spaces, distrust of water, and at the same time, a new awareness that cleanliness is not comfort, it is survival, and that progress is not only factories and railways, but sewage, ventilation, hygiene, things that are rarely written about in heroic stories. But they are the ones quietly reducing the number of graves. The unseen lesson. By the end of the 19th century, London was different. Not perfect, not sterile, but much less deadly. Epidemics no longer seemed like a punishment from heaven. They became phenomena that could be studied, explained, and most importantly, warned. The germ theory of disease was slowly but surely changing the world. The idea that tiny organisms could cause death turned medicine, urban planning, and everyday life upside down. What had previously been blamed on bad air now had specific causes, specific sources, specific mechanisms of transmission. Public toilets were no longer just a convenience. They became part of the public health system. Ventilation, drainage, regular cleaning, water, soap. It would seem trifles, but it is the trifles that change the survival statistics. The city learned its lesson at a high price. Thousands of deaths, years of fear, generations living in the shadow of diseases that they did not understand. The irony was that the greatest danger was almost banal. Not war, not fires, not crime, but everyday things. Water, hygiene, sanitation. What seems like the background of life today was then a matter of life and death. London was not unique. The same problems existed in Paris, New York, Hamburg. History repeated itself in different cities. First, unsanitary conditions. Then, epidemics. Then, panic. And only after that, reforms. Humanity rarely learns in advance. Most often, after tragedies. But when the lesson is finally learned, it changes the future forever. Because after that, it is no longer possible to look at cleanliness as a whim. It becomes a shield, invisible, daily, vital. A place that wasn't just a toilet. The Victorian public toilet was never just a toilet. It was a mirror of the era, a place where progress and blindness intersected, engineering and ignorance, ordinariness and risk. People descended with ordinary thoughts, haste, fatigue, habit. And almost no one realized that they were standing at a point where the city was touching its own dark side. Unsanitary conditions did not look like a catastrophe. They looked like the norm. The smells were familiar. The dampness was familiar. The discomfort was familiar. Death came quietly, later, in the form of fever, in the form of exhaustion, in the form of a disease that they still could not properly explain. Public toilets have become a symbol of civilization, but at the same time a symbol of error, because infrastructure without an understanding of biology can be dangerous, because progress without hygiene does not save, because a city is not just buildings and roads, it is water, waste, air, control. London paid for this lesson, expensively. But it was these tragedies that changed the future of cities around the world. Sewage has become the standard. Clean water is a priority. Hygiene is the basis of survival. And today, when we enter a clean, well-lit space, we almost never think that such a place could once have been a source of fear, a source of disease, a source of death. And perhaps the main question of this story: do we notice the dangers to which we are accustomed? Do we realize how many things in our lives seem normal only because we were born after other people's tragedies? This is not a horror story. This is history. If you like this format, slow, disturbing, real stories of survival from the past, subscribe to the channel. There are still many places ahead where the ordinary turns out to be dangerous.